Hi, welcome to another one of these China-Iran chats. I am Jonathan Fulton. This is for the China-MENA newsletter. Last week, I did a bunch of conversations, mostly with academics, looking at the China-Iran perspective. From an academic perspective, I was really looking for two different things this week. I want to talk to somebody who could provide an American look at it and somebody who's plugged into the policy community to give us a sense of how does America see the China-Iran relationship? How does it affect America's interests? I couldn't think of a better person than my old friend, Jonathan Panifkoff, who is the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And the timing couldn't be better because last week, you guys had a major report drop, the future of U.S. strategy toward Iran, a bipartisan roadmap for the next administration. Jonathan, congratulations on the report. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me and appreciate that. It was a long slog to get there, but we're really proud of the outcome of the report.
You should be. It's enormous. I mean, I have to be honest, I haven't finished it because it's like an 80-page document, but
Yeah.
it's comprehensive. I know you've been working, you and your team have been working a lot on this for a very long time. So it's something you guys must be really excited about and doing a lot of promo, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of promo publicly and then a lot of briefings. We've been surprised, not so much by the US government interest, folks on the Hill in the executive branch, but the number of ambassadors here in Washington who really want us to talk to them about it. The number of meetings I've had via Zoom and briefings with folks in foreign capitals in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia. Um, it's clearly gotten some traction, and we're excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not something to be at all excited about, but the timing of this is really pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I think I said at one of our recent briefings that I couldn't have predicted or asked for this type of timing when we initially conceived of the report almost 2 years ago. But the reality is, between the lull in clear U.S. strategy toward Iran after negotiations of reentering JCPOA ended almost 2 years ago, combined with the conflicts in the region now for the more than the last year, it obviously has brought the issue center stage.
So just to get, I know there's a subsection here that's looking at China, which I found really interesting. Before looking directly at what the report says about China, just from a DC perspective, how does China's engagement with Iran um, challenge or undermine America's preferences for the Middle East?
I think the answer to that is quite significantly, and I think there's a concern that it's growing as well. For a number of years, the US viewed China, frankly, as having similar views that a nuclear Iran was bad for the region, but it was also bad for China, that what all the other issues the US and China are having, Iran might be one that they could work together on. And there was obviously decent synergy from the original JCPOA. I think the view in Washington has shifted a little bit now. I think it's still of the common view that China probably doesn't want a nuclear Iran and would not be happy about that. But the willingness and how far China's willing to go and engage and work with the US, I think there's a lot more skepticism over that today. And when you look specifically at Iranian malign influence in the region, which is not where the US and China have converged on that particular issue, the US has spent the last year plus trying to do everything possible to ensure that there wasn't a war in the region. And the view is China has not, and has, if not, taken advantage of the situation. It's certainly not done everything it can to really press Iran, for instance, to stop and aiding a number of the proxy groups and the terrorist groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, certainly. And so it's created a level of, frankly, intensified frustration toward China over this issue that's all underlined and based, frankly, in the end on the fact, and I'm sure we'll get to this, that the US views China as Iran's life raft right now economically. And it's really frustrated about that, especially.
I've often argued publicly and time and again, I think the perception that China has sufficient leverage in Tehran to get the government there to not do things is a lot more limited than we often give it credit for. What's your take on this? I mean, obviously the life raft is important that China is buying this oil that's putting cash back into the Iranian military to do the awful stuff it's been doing. Um, but do you get a sense that I'm off at base on this, that China actually could use a little more effort to get Iran to change its behavior?
Yeah, I don't want to exaggerate this. Do I think China could use a little more effort in terms of how susceptible Iran is to Beijing's demands? I do. And I think it would have some impact. But I want to be clear, I don't think that just because Beijing says to Iran, do X or do Y, that's going to change Iranian decision making or calculus, or it's just going to be a reactive, absolutely whatever you say. That I don't believe. In fact, in some ways nowadays, and I think this will be more true going forward, ironically, there may be a stronger argument that Moscow at the moment may end up with more leverage, not economically, but the defense ties and the security ties and what Iran is worried about and where Iran is wanting to go may become a bigger challenge. But I think, there's been a lot of criticism, and I do not want anybody to think that I'm making this exact parallel. I'm just using an example. There's been a lot of criticism that the US has not used sufficient leverage against Israel. And I've been among those who have said for a while now, people misunderstand, and US leverage toward Israel is far more limited than you think. Israel's not just going to be responsive. The difference is the US has tried, and there have been places that has made a difference. I think the US view right now is China hasn't even tried with Iran. The only place that it's really gotten involved is when its own interests were at foot. For instance, shipping and commercial transit through the Red Sea and getting the Houthis to not be targeting Chinese ships as well, which has been a huge success for China and for Russia at a time when Western commerce is really dropped by over 50%. Chinese and Russian commerce transiting the Red Sea is up by almost the same proportion over the last year.
Sure. I don't know if you've seen this, but last week, Chinese leaders started talking a little differently about Israel, saying Israel has a legitimate right to defend itself. They started to actually acknowledge that Hamas was involved in this conflict, that Hezbollah is involved in it. Do you think that provides any wiggle room if China starts to look at regional tensions differently, that it might be a little closer than maybe it was even a month ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first place actually I saw it was in your newsletter.
Oh, good,
So that
good
was quite
promo.
helpful. Exactly. Look, I think I would defer, frankly, to you and a number of the China experts in terms of what was behind the decision-making calculus of China making that change now. It seems to me that it's probably more superficial than actually long-term meaningful. I think the
Yeah.
Israelis are quite skeptical, and I know the US is quite skeptical about it. I do think that eventually the reality is there's very few conflicts nowadays that end solely through military solutions. There usually have to be some sort of political outcome, diplomatic solution associated with them. And I think China has made clear it wants to play a bigger role in the region, and it thinks that it has the opportunity to play a bigger role in the region. And so if some of it's to that end, I don't know where it's going to affect the decision-making calculus vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis Iran or vis-a-vis Israel. But I do think that, there's a real skepticism by folks in Israel now, especially even more so, given how China has treated the situation over the
Yeah.
last year. And even in Iran, ironically, as frustrated as the US is about the Iran-Chinese relationship, I think the Iranians feel like the Chinese could have done more to help or should be doing more to help. And so it's this and that folks like me, who are really Middle East folks, will be fascinated to see where China really tries to go and balance its interests in the coming, frankly, months and years.
Yeah, I think that holds up. Like the point you made a couple of minutes ago about the maybe a greater weight for Russia, because I think one thing that we've seen is, however you view Russia's actions in Syria, I think a lot of folks in the Middle East know, like, hey, that's somebody that's going to the wall for an ally, whatever it costs. And I've heard so many people from Arab countries that deeply resented that, but kind of said, I wish we had that kind of relationship with a great power that was willing to just, full speed ahead. And I think
Yeah.
for Iran, they'd probably look at this and think, okay, we've seen what Russia's willing to do in a conflict. We haven't seen this from China. So in an existential crisis, China's SOEs are going to come and help us rebuild, or they're going to, invest in infrastructure. They're not going to bring a military and help us when we need it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's the ironic kind of inverse of Arab frustration about the US, right? Especially in the Gulf. There's been this view, especially after the oil facilities attack in both Saudi and the UAE a number of years ago now, but that still comes up a lot, that ultimately they don't feel like they're sufficiently under a US defense umbrella. And not being under that defense umbrella is actually what drove them in part to try to hedge off and say, okay, we're going to try a different approach with Iran of rapprochement. That not that we're changing our views about the threat that Iran poses or its proxies pose, but we don't have the confidence that the US is going to be there for us like they are, ironically, for Israel. And so you've got two broad challenges here. One is you've got this irony that it's China that helped at the very end conclude the deal between Saudi and Iran, playing that role to the extent that they thought they could. And then you've got this irony that as a number of Arab states are increasingly angry and frustrated about Israeli actions in the region, whether Gaza, Lebanon, what may come in Iran, you also hear very quietly from a number of senior folks, but if the US doesn't defend Israel and the US were to stop supporting Israel, as you're hearing on, say, college campuses in the US, it would be in some ways a really awful signal to a lot of our Arab colleagues who
Yeah.
are terribly concerned that the would mean, well, then if they're not going to be there for Israel, they're definitely not going to be there for us. And it pushes those folks, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi, closer to China. The days of, black and white and these little neat boxes of regional expertise, I think, are quickly fading, and all of us have to start learning more about China and Russia and the overlaps. It's intersecting too much.
For sure. So directly with the report, looking at the China section, one of the findings is that the U.S. shouldn't be thinking about coordinating policy with China on certain Middle East issues, especially as it pertains to Iran, that you're better off adopting a competitive approach that maybe Arab heavy lifting as cooperation. Maybe the Saudis could their good offices with China to try to influence Iran. Could you maybe give us a little bit more about this idea that competition with China in the Middle East is probably the way to address Iran?
Yeah, I think that what it really came out of was this concern that, we had been talking about it and thinking about, frankly, the history of how China has engaged. And on this issue, on the issue of Iran. And, if you go back to the JCPOA era, you actually had decent coordination that allowed JCPOA to come into being, and China was actually meaningfully helpful. I think there is significant skepticism today that you would have nearly as much Chinese help. What maybe you could get it on the nuclear issue specifically, but the report outlines very explicitly that in this day and age, you can't separate the nuclear issue from the regional malign issue, and you can't prioritize one over the other as you did in the 2013, 14, 15 period. I don't think China is nearly in the same place when it comes to regional malign influence. The reality is China has used the last year to frankly ensure that even as everybody else was attacked in the Red Sea, as we talked about, their ships were not. And I think Beijing's view of the world now more and more so is also becoming, one of Washington versus one of Beijing. And you're competing for a number of the same folks. You're competing for ultimate alliances with the global South, especially. We saw the BRICS meeting just recently. I'm still skeptical the BRICS are going to have a meaningful impact, but having that alliance come together and those countries come together in the way they are does get beyond symbolism. It creates I think, a risk for a lot of folks, that it's going to be new avenues of competition. And so I think there's a real view that with China, when it comes to Iran, you're going to have to compete with them. They're just not going to be a forthright actor that's going to be meaningfully helpful, in part because at the end of the day, more than anything, I think we think China sees anything that it's able to do to undermine US presence, US posture in the Middle East as potentially a net benefit for China, and a net benefit for China in the region, with the global South, as a partner. The line from China that you hear over and over and over again is not getting involved in internal affairs. There's good reasons, obviously, as you know better than I, China doesn't want to do that. But in Iran, that's especially meaningful, and especially meaningful to the government, but it also resonates with a lot of Arab states. It's not traditionally how the US has engaged. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge. And then maybe the last thing I'll say on this is, we talk about competing with China, but there's also, if China is going to work with us on the nuclear issue, that's great. But competing with China on Iran also means not allowing China to simply continue fund and support Iran in the same way it has by buying black market oil. And we've spent a lot of time talking about enforcement of sanctions. And one of the things that became clear is that enforcement of sanctions is a challenge, especially when it comes to China by the time the oil is already there. Trying to sanction some of the teapot refineries just doesn't have a lot of impact. We spend a lot of time trying to think about that. And so we've actually put out an idea to do it another way, to look at the third party actors like Malaysia, who are allowing the blending of oil from Iran off of its coast that then goes to China. So we think there's new ways to kind of undermine and put the noose around the relationship a little bit tighter. But it's certainly going to be a challenge. And I think we're just at a point of believing that you're going to have to compete with them, with Iran, and in the region as a whole.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of stories just over the past 2 weeks about putting some teeth on the sanctions in terms of oil that makes its way to China. And I wonder about that, if just that opportunism that we've seen over the past year is going to really come back and bite them in the backside, because, everything Iran's been doing in the past year really makes that relationship a lot more radioactive.
Yeah, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, there's going to be a question of, can China really fundamentally undermine what's been the traditional, liberal international order and the global order and the rules of the game? I think a lot of us are skeptical, but it's putting together a um, group of countries, formally or informally, um, playing on grievances, frankly, that I think they're trying to make work and think they can make work. I think time will tell if that's true or not. But Iran plays into this. We've said for a while, Iran is simply, in the Middle East as a region, is not Latin America. You can't geographically isolate it away. And we're seeing that from the commercial ties. We're seeing this from the amount of global attention on the region for the wars. We're seeing this on the impact of US and allied defense considerations, both in the Red Sea, but also in the Mediterranean, vis-a-vis protecting Israel. All of that is going to come into play. And I think it's just a question ultimately of how much Beijing is really going to go. We said earlier, just it hasn't demonstrated a willingness to put skin in the game beyond construction or maybe logistics, commercial ties. If that changes, then that's going to be, I think, a real challenge for the US and for others. But if it doesn't, you would think the US should still be able, with its allies, to compete meaningfully, to keep the region, to ensure China is not locked out, but not playing a role that allows it to undermine US and Western interests. US politics are coming up, our elections are coming up. I don't know where President Harris or President Trump would go with this. I think there's going to be some different views. And so even on the US side, though, that's a real debate. It's a real debate that we had about how involved the US should be in the region. But it's playing in very, very seriously. The China question exists everywhere, including in the Middle East.
Absolutely. there was a time where we could talk about, certain issues here in Abu Dhabi and China would never come up. And that time has passed. We're well past that point. Jonathan, thanks so much for this. I know you're super busy. Congratulations again on getting the report out. All of the, I know when something like this happens, you have a brief moment where you're like, it's done. But now you've got weeks and weeks of now I'm going to be talking about it and promoting it and briefing about it. So you're no less busy. But I really encourage, I'll put a link to the report on this page to share with people. I encourage you to read it, get a sense of how folks in the US are thinking about this issue. And I know we're talking about very serious stuff, but I do feel I have to offer my condolences for the New York Mets having been knocked out of the playoffs.
Well, thank you very much on the report. Encourage people to read it. I appreciate the link. We're very proud of it. And as for the Mets, it was a heck of a ride. Maybe the most fun team I remember watching since '99 or
Since 86.
2000. A lot of us are proud. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, man. Well, again, thanks a lot. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Oops.